Welcome everybody to this webinar on innovation in the age of disruption. My name is Jeanette Hammer Andersen. I work as a professor at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, and I'm involved in Digital Life Norway, and I have the honor of being the moderator of this webinar. So this webinar is co-hosted by the Center of Digital Life Norway and the Life Science Cluster. So Center of Digital Life Norway is a national center for biotechnology research, education, and innovation. The center shall facilitate transdisciplinary collaboration across institution fields of research and the research projects in the center. And we also have the Life Science Cluster here. So Hanne Mette, you might say some word about the Life Science Cluster.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and we're very happy to do this webinar together and also with our distinguished guests as you will present later on. So the Life Science Cluster, we are a network of companies and organizations for which life science is key. So we have approximately 120 members across both health, technology, marine and agricultural life sciences. And also we are aiming to strengthen collaboration between the different kinds of players. So we really look forward to this webinar.
Thank you, Hanne Mette. So the topic of today is innovation in the age of disruption. So the program is that we will have a talk from Professor Jerome Engel, and then we will have a discussion with the panelists. So I will introduce them now, but they will also have time later to say something more. So we have with us Professor Jerome Engel from University of California at Berkeley. He is an internationally recognized expert on innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capital lecturing, and advising business and government leaders around the world. We also have the pleasure to have Natsai Odrechisa. She's a founder and CEO at Faber Futures. She's a leading thinker on transformative role design can play in the equitable development on consumer biotechnology. And also Anita Patel-Yusnes, which is currently a patient journal chapter lead at Roche, which is also a member of the Life Science Cluster. She also recently just came from genetic analysis. We might hear more about that later. She has almost 25 years experience in biotechnology. So we're really happy to have such a diverse but also very competent panel. I'm looking forward to listening in and hear more about your background and expertise. But first, I will give the screen to Professor Engel to give us a presentation about innovation in the age of disruption. Please.
Well, thank you so much. It's a true pleasure to be with everybody this morning or this afternoon in your case. I'm talking to you from Silicon Valley or the town of San Rafael, if you're familiar with the Bay Area. And I come to this topic as a practitioner. I want to share that, and an investor, even though I am a professor at the university and have an academic background. My real perspective is as somebody who helps build businesses and observing how they evolve. So I've been a venture capitalist. I founded a couple of businesses of my own, one of which was successful, the others totally failed. And I have a lot of big company experience in terms of management at Ernst & Young and KPMG and in other venues. So in my career, I had the great opportunity of having people come and ask me essentially, how does Silicon Valley work? So, of course, that's a bit of an absurd question, but it's an important one. I mean, it's difficult to get your arms around. And I figured I had to develop an answer. So when I joined the faculty at UC Berkeley, I used that opportunity to reflect on what can I add to the literature, what can I add to the teaching experience. And this question of what makes a community of innovation work became central to me over the last decades. And that's where I've published and done my work. The thing about that that's important for us is that certainly in this century, if you will, and since 2000, we've seen so many disruptions. And the question is, are these macroeconomic disruptions and disruptions of the sort of ecosphere of entrepreneurship and innovation, how do they trigger each other? How do they interrelate? And more recently, with the COVID disruption, how responsive are these innovation communities? And how responsive are the individual components of those communities? And how should that affect how we do our work, do our research, think about opportunity, and think about the lifetime of innovation and how to have innovation with impact? In preparing my talk today, I came up with these topics: the challenge that we face in the turbulent time, the role of geography, which I think is substantial. What is the opportunity that comes from disruption, and what strategies can we adopt to encourage a flywheel or a virtual value creation cycle? So let's look for a moment at the obvious question about what makes our time a turbulent time, and is it unique in its level of turbulence? My thesis is going to be based on my observations in my own community. This is a picture of Berkeley, and because that's where my personal ecosystem anchors, but also in research I've done in collaboration with 20 plus academics around the world who've looked, and we've used a common framework to look at our own ecosystems. And this goes from Barcelona to Singapore, even to, I shouldn't say even to Norway, and to Norway, and in the life sciences sphere there. So we've looked at a number of ecosystems around the world, and we've reached some generalized conclusions, and I'm going to share them with you. This innovation theme is an important one to understand from the perspective of that change is intrinsic, I think, in the innovation context. That innovation means you're moving from one state to another state, and hopefully in a constructive direction. So I generally use the definition for innovation to be a constructive response to stress or change. Oftentimes that stressor, that forcing function of change, is technology, because it's that incremental, ongoing scientific discovery and engineering application of technology to problems that puts pressure on incumbents. In other words, those companies, those power centers that currently control access to the beneficiary, the customer, the end user. And without this pressure of technological change or ecological change, external pressures, those who have control will stay in control. The incumbents don't want to be disrupted. So COVID-19 is the obvious example for us in healthcare, but there are more recent examples as well. But when you looked at that, you wondered if, it's such a big crisis, how did we adopt? Well, we adopted by going online, and you wonder, is the world ever going to be the same again? Will we always be looking at the world through this lens of innovation? Looking back pre-March 2020 versus post-March 2020. But the shocks didn't stop coming, of course. We have war in Europe, we have inflation, we have supply chain chaos with the restoration of demand side as the economies come back. And, and more recently, the one that's been very much on our minds here in Silicon Valley is, of course, the banking failure we had, which totally was unexpected. And there are many lessons to be learned there. But it's not the obvious failure of a bank taking risk. It's the unobvious fact that they had huge deposits because of the strength of the venture capital economy, and the companies not wanting to take risk with their cash. So they put it in the bank that was the favorite bank of the community. And that bank didn't match the timing of their investments with the capital requirements of the companies. Because as we have the down cycle in venture capital, which we're having right now, that created a withdrawal demand that could not be met. So that creates these huge shocks. Now it's like out of left field. So we don't know where these shocks are going to come from. So the question is really, well, we can't plan, on exactly what the shock's going to be, but can we plan to be responsive? And are looking at these, we looked at 20 plus communities, and when we looked at them, we found that indeed, communities that focus on innovation and in short cycle deployment of technology have more skill at responding to disruptions and can take advantage of them. So is that a lucky situation? Well, if you ask, Richard Hammond, famous mathematician, Louis Pasteur, they both had the same quote, essentially, is that luck favors the prepared. And so innovation and response to innovation, like Zoom and the tool we're using right now for a global conference, that was so quick to respond, but it didn't come overnight. In other words, Zoom was, there's Skype, Zoom, there were other solutions out there that were putting years of effort into creating these platforms so they were robust enough to respond when a need was there. And then they became ubiquitous. So how does that apply to us in healthcare? Well, the obvious is the vaccine, right? I mean, mRNA technology did not come overnight. It's been, in development for many years. Its use in vaccine development is, well established in the research level. So, but would it have ever penetrated, the large incumbents? Would it have disrupted them? Maybe at some point. But this was the point, because all of a sudden there was a global problem, and we needed a global response, and the capital was there, and the energy was there. And if you look at the solutions, the key is in reducing that 4-year development time to a 4-month development time. You look at all these different solutions brought to you by Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson and Novavax. They're all partnerships with small companies who develop technology and then license or partner that technology to large companies that could do the large scale vaccine development rapidly. The one exception, of course, is Moderna, which is, there's always an exception to the case. But the thesis here is that large companies can be disrupted from within by looking to small companies to gain access to the edge case, to the special case, to the unique case. And then when mass markets become available, those partnerships can lead the way. And in some cases, companies individually can break through and sustain their independence and participate, like Moderna has done so well. So, there are many vectors in healthcare for this type of innovation that have been opened up through, CRISPR and other molecular design technologies. And we're going to see these breakthroughs occur, sometimes incrementally, and sometimes seemingly overnight. The other point I would raise is crossovers. In other words, this is not just genetic or biotechnology, if you will, but it's crossovers from other fields, like artificial intelligence, obviously, is all in the news, but robotics and microfluidics, sensors. These are all technologies that cross over into life sciences. And we're going to see, and we are seeing tremendous leapfrog gains in crossover applications. Designer babies are not a thing of the future anymore. It's a capability that is highly controversial, and I'm not endorsing it by any means. But the idea that we can engineer the genome is well understood, and there are companies who do that in some form or other. Personalized medicine, we have recognitions of that. New models for throughput on therapeutics. Of course, CRISPR and the great rapid deployment we see of that now in many different venues. And the example I like to point to, if you go back a couple of decades, was PCR. All of us that are lab scientists probably have PCR machines at the end of the bench, and we might take them for granted because they cost us a few $1,000s. It's not a major investment. But when they developed the PCR, it came out of some science at Berkeley, and it was commercialized, et cetera. I saw the rapid reduction of a lab scale device that would cost millions of dollars to build, and it was not a very smooth looking device. These little bench devices that cost a few $1,000s. It's that kind of scaling. And now with robotics, these efficiencies take things that are moving relatively slow and make them much shorter cycle. Life sciences is known for having long life cycle developments. But we're seeing them compressed, especially with the crossover of artificial intelligence and sensors, etc. So how do we accelerate these slow industries like life sciences? And just quickly, if you take defense spending, that's a real place where technology gets deployed. And this drone, these drones are very popular these days, unfortunately, in the armed services when they're in combat now every day over Eastern Europe. A major component of this drone is its intelligence system. And there was a bespoke or a unique system that was built for this drone that a young scientist playing around with one, on the Defense Department's budget, discovered that they could replace this very bespoke $6,000 computer with essentially an Apple handheld computer. So essentially, they've taken the guts of your telephone and gotten a 10-to-1 cost advantage by using what they call off-the-shelf technology versus bespoke custom technology. That's a crossover in a very crude sense. Let's look at this one. It's a Fitbit, obviously, right? And when they first came out, is it a fad? Or is it just something fabulous? And by fabulous, I mean like, oh my God, how fabulous that is! Look, it's so cute. Well, toy or tool. It's now we're all wearing. I mean, I'm wearing on my wrist. I mean, exactly this watch you're seeing here, and it has a lot of medical applications that we're all familiar. I mean, I can take an EKG. While it's a crude one, I can do an EKG, and if I'm sure we're going to have these types of consumer devices actually taken seriously by the medical professionals over time. But I can take an EKG and create a PDF and ship it off to my doctor, and he can have a quick look and tell me whether I got to come in or not, rather than having to go to the emergency room and utilize resources that may not be necessary. So anyway, this is now also moving to have a sensor involved for measuring blood sugar levels and blood oxygen levels. So we know with diabetes how crucial blood sugar and insulin level measurement is, and how invasive that is to do the thumb prick. Well, that's all going to be a thing of the past within a few years. So these are not toys. They are really tools. And this continuous non-invasive, remotely monitored, and maybe AI monitored type of capability is coming very quickly. So this is what I call innovation from the edge. It's the innovation got deployed in a consumer space. And the advantage of that is that there are thousands and thousands of deployments, millions of deployments. And therefore, you get a better opportunity to low risk, incrementally enhance the technology that can then cross over to the serious application. If you start with the goal of building, the serious medical application, you run right into the regulatory constraints, right into the safety constraints, where if you start with the trivial, if you will, keeping time on your wrist application and having that harmonized with, some other trend like mobile telephones, you have these huge number of opportunities for deployment and innovation. So we're seeing that happen in artificial intelligence. And this is, of course, the disruptive platform of the day. I mean, the internet was a disruptive platform in its day, then the World Wide Web, and now AI, and it'll be just as disruptive. And as in many innovations, the initial innovations here you can see on this heat map back in 2015 were in healthcare, because people want to save lives and it makes sense. Like, we have this capability, let's see if we can deploy it immediately where it's most important. But very quickly, when you see a good platform, this is just 2 years later, the same heat map, it essentially shows the quick diffusion, by 2017. And now we're 5 years later, this heat map would not make any sense anymore because it would all just be red. So many young companies starting to deploy innovations across industries. So the examples of digital health, obviously, are right on the table for this group. And again, I want to thank Digital Health Norway and the Life Science Cluster for giving me a chance to make this point to this important audience. So you can look, if you want to see where there's evolution in going to be in med tech, you can look at what's going on in sports tech. In other words, things that are deployed for sport where it's non-critical oftentimes can cross over to medical applications. So we could discuss some of these examples when we have time. But you might want to look at Neurotrainer, which is a company doing exactly that, using measurements of neuroscience inputs around the brain. And now the next question is, how do you get the scale? The first point was you got the speed by working with young companies. How do you get the scale? And that's the real challenge. And I'm saying combining oftentimes the innovation that resides and emerges in a small company with big companies that have global penetration, that can be a clue for scale. And in the longer term, we're going to see scale impacted by the emerging middle class around the world. And that in serving the unserved populations, if you will, are the real thresholds for a lot of the technologies we're working on. It's not just in the first world, but also in the third world. And diabetes is an example for that. Diabetes is a place where a lot of people place a lot of attention. Obviously, in the United States, we have a high consumption, high sugar, high diabetes population. But where else do you have it? You have it in India and you have it in China. So we might see, real experimentation and real adoption coming in different markets where they might have a different regulatory approach because of not having the distribution system that first world nations have. And I apologize to anybody who just caught me calling China not a first world system. But there are two worlds in China. There's the first world for sure. That's 350 million people. And then there's the unserved population, the rural population of 1 billion people. So they have both components. Same thing for India. So speed and scale, you get there through this combination. And you can look at the generic attributes of innovation and you bring it into life sciences and healthcare. And when I look at life sciences and healthcare, I want to emphasize there's not just product innovation. It's not just the things that become innovative. It's the hows as well. So the hows you might call as business model innovation, new treatment models or even new financial models for reimbursement. And there's innovation in governance. For instance, the United States, we struggle with our system because we don't have a single payer model. We don't have both. In the US, they call it socialized medicine, simply meaning government reimbursement. We have a combined model, which is really socialized in its base, but layered on top of an insurance model where the individual or the employer pays for insurance. So it's a very inefficient system. And in the US, a lot of healthcare innovation in the long term, if it's going to have effect, it's going to require innovation in our governance. So what's the role of geography? And I'll touch on this just quickly, but it's one of my central interests. And my hypothesis for you is that where you are impacts how you innovate. And when I look at San Francisco as a case, and I look at it, 20 years ago, the skyline was a financially centered skyline. The pyramid is an insurance company. The big black box here is the biggest bank, Bank of America. These are all financial institutions and professions that serve them. If you look at that same place through a different lens 20 years later, these are all technology companies. And those financial companies are down here. I mean, they're like physically surpassed, if you will, by the physical manifestation of software firms and every internet vertical you can think of. They didn't locate in Silicon Valley, located in the city. And why? It's because the people working in those firms wanted to live in the city. And that's this idea of concentration of people and concentration of industry and seeking urban core settings for that is a new evolution. So when you look at this geography, you could look at different maps and you look at the people in those maps and who leads and who follows. And I'm just taking you on a tour here of different innovation neighborhoods I've visited or lectured at, even in Russia, if you will. But the most interesting one for me, because it's so clear, is Israel and the Tel Aviv Silicon Valley connection, and this idea of these concentrations of places of change. And even back, this happens to be Barcelona. So, even back in 2014, when I was in Tel Aviv, I was going to talk about that example. The thing I loved that I saw is a meetup. In other words, I was coming back to my hotel and they were hanging this sign, that is, a bunch of engineers were going to get together and talk about innovation, like we are today. And it's these meetups, these congruences, when you bring people together with shared interests that go beyond their enterprise, that break the barriers of the enterprise, whether it's an academic institution or a business enterprise, and you get cross-fertilization. That's when you get this great behavior. And so geography matters. There are concentrations of industries, as Michael Porter pointed out, but it's the emergence, it's creating communities where the emergence of new businesses is part of the very center of their identity. And that creates a different view on innovation that moves to a behavior-centric view. And we don't have time to go into that now. We might discuss it in the Q&A. So that kind of evolution leads to building communities that have sequential evolutions, not just one center of evolution. And these are cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural almost. It takes engineers working with scientists, physicists working with chemists, computer scientists working with mathematicians, working with biologists. All this builds congruence and power. So we like to say that Silicon Valley is a state of mind. In other words, that innovation communities, it's a state of mind. And I'm just showing you some of the research we did to support that. 2 publications that include these examples. And the thesis of clustering was supported across all these ecosystems. And we might think about how we collaborate with others in our ecosystems. We distilled it to 7 components and 5 behaviors. I'll just touch on them as I wrap up. The 7 components, there's nothing very unique about identifying the components of an innovation ecosystem. Sure, we have universities creating technology, entrepreneurs exploiting the technology, hopefully financial sources like venture capital or government funds supporting their scaling, and then major corporations participating in the process. And we saw how that happened. So there's a virtual cycle that can be created that takes advantage of large pools of money in government and in pension funds, and takes advantage when it's available of the public markets to benchmark the value of these private enterprises and to create an exit opportunity. These are the elements, in a very rough way, of the cluster of innovation. These 7 elements, the foundational elements of the universities, the management professionals, and government, and the active major elements, the entrepreneurs, the venture capital investors, and the major corporations. Every economy is different. Some, like Singapore, have a strong government influence and funding. Some, like Europe, have a dominance by the major corporations. But every community has the same 7 elements. They interact. So in creating this kind of community, we can look at context, the actors, and the enablers. So the actors are those middle 3 components. They're the core actors. The supporting elements are the 4 I mentioned. They're essential to create the context for innovation. And that can lead to a faster, more innovative society. Entrepreneurs bring the speed. And let me just share one framework with you, which I think is essential for everyone to understand. That this S curve of innovation really reflects what we're all involved in, whether it's research or deployment of technology at maturity. And the space where the rubber meets the road, if you will, where new technologies and new business models, new deployment happen, are right here where the curve accelerates. And this isn't one business or just, it's really the view of an emerging technology. That technology may get deployed in a number of businesses in this cycle of rapid innovation. So everybody has a role to play. And that's about the universities, create the research and identify the intellectual property and capabilities, the entrepreneurs, accelerate the innovation process, and the major corporations can be a real aid to bring this all to scale. So with that, there's much I could share about the entrepreneurial context, but the important thing to take away here is that the components interact and that behaviors are the key. So these behaviors are win-win behaviors. And I just want to mention the 5 key behaviors are encouraging the mobility of resource, encouraging the entrepreneurial process, coming to agreements that align interests together, and take a global perspective on opportunity. And don't just look to local partners for linkages, but look for global linkages. So mobility of resources is the money, people, and know-how. The entrepreneurial process is relentless pursuit of opportunity. The alignment of interest is shared risk and shared reward, oftentimes shared ownership. The global perspective is being born global, thinking of opportunity from a global perspective from day one. And the linkages are recognizing that global opportunities are pursued in partnership with people in other communities. So we have to have the sensitivity as to how to build those global relationships. So with that, I'll close my remarks and thank you for your attention and turn it back to our chairperson for leading the questions with the panel. Thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you very much for this really nice presentation. It's very inspiring. I started reading your book, this Cluster of Innovation in the Age of Disruption, and really I think the components and, like you say, the ecosystem, the behavior, these are things that needs to be matched up to really do the innovation. But I think, as you said, geographic matters. So if you are in an environment that allows you to sort of work around this and sort of build the behavior that's needed to do the innovation. So we should now get on with some questions, and if there are questions from the chat, I will have a look. But before that, I will ask, starting off with Natsai, maybe you could say something, introduce yourself to us. I gave you a brief introduction, but to the audience, please.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you so much, Jerome, for that brilliant presentation. My name is Natsai Odwicheva, and I'm the founder of Faber Futures. We are a London-based agency that works at the intersection of biotechnology, design, and society. And really, our core mission is to upstream the tool set that designers have in the design of the kinds of systems we need to scale biotechnology in such a way that it can deliver benefit and in an equitable way. So it's a very niche preoccupation that I have, and have spent many years trying to make the case for, first of all, what is design, particularly when you are interfacing with technologists and scientists who call themselves organism designers, for example. And then you quickly realize, once you start talking, that we are designing different contexts and different scale. How do we start to bring those two things together? And this matters primarily because what's designed in the lab is going to go out into the wild and live in the real world. And designers are very adept at understanding, at least from an anthropological lens, the implications of real world context for anything that is designed. So my studio really focuses on finding different ways to build out some of the potential futures that emerging biotechnologies may have, particularly in the context of materiality. And so if you can engineer an organism in the lab for it to create a bioconcrete, how does that map onto architecture? My background is architecture, so this is very important to understand. What are the implications of growing materials, growing buildings, as opposed to building buildings? So design is a very useful tool to unpack what that means from a philosophical perspective, from a technical one, but crucially from a creative one. Because I think what we need is, just looking at this notion of entrepreneurship and innovation as a team sport, who's on the team and when do they get to play? And I think what we see with innovation is that the humanities and creativity, the poets come in right at the end, a lot of the times to put lipstick on a pig. So how do we undo that and enable the creatives to come into the lab space to start helping determine and shape what the core research question is? So that's primarily what I focus on. And we do so with a range of different stakeholders within, I guess, what would be framed as the bioeconomy. So from policymakers to biotech startups, usually in Silicon Valley, usually in the East Coast of the United States, because that's where the concentration of much of this is. But we also work with institutions who have a wider reach through the public sphere in starting to communicating the kind of technological changes that are coming. And again, design is a brilliant vehicle to do this.
Great, thank you, Nasa. I really like that you have this on Faber Future, learning from nature, making with life. I really like that statement that you have on your webpage. I will come back with some questions for you. So Anita, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. This is really, really inspiring. After listening to Professor Engel and also you, Nasa, I feel like we're just, in the age of innovation and disruption, it's getting more and more normal in a way. It's not going to be, it's the new normal, if you can say. My background is pharma predominantly, because I started in GSK and worked in the larger corporations who take all this innovation to the market. But I also worked in mid-sized companies, Norwegian companies like Pronova, Biopharma, who had the fish oil refinery innovation that took the world by storm by making a pharma product out of omega-3. So, I mean, this is also a story that I like to share because it shows, from the, like you said, Nasa, from the lab to the whole world, it became $1 billion product, and it's done all through partnership and ecosystems, like the professor told us. So I had that experience, and then I also joined a Norwegian startup 2 years ago, which was introduced by Jeanette, called Genetic Analysis. And here I worked with microbiome and microbiome's role in future healthcare in terms of prevention, treatment, and also diagnostics. It's an amazing uncovered potential there that I think is going to disrupt the way we look at medicine in the future. So that part was really exciting for me to be a part of. And now I jump back to the larger corporation, and I'm proud to be a part of Roche today, and also to be able to connect these dots. If you may, like Professor Engel said, that there are so many components that needs to be in place. And me being here in Oslo, in Norway, I really would like us to think in the whole area space of clustering, and not only geographically, but also like digitally. I think we have so much more we can do here in Norway. So I'm a big passionate about, the life science cluster and how to build that science park in Oslo that's coming up. Are we going to do the traditional mix there, or are we going to disrupt the way we think in Norway as well? So this is me in a nutshell. Also proud to take questions, but I really think that we're in the time of innovation, where innovation and disruption is normal, and that's the both scary part, but also opportunity part that lies ahead of us.
Thank you, Anita. Yeah, so that sort of your last words there sort of leads me into the first question I have. So about fear? Like in this age, is innovation driven by the desire to mitigate fear or to embrace the abundance? Like, or in other words, faced by climate change, COVID, war, and other crises, what is really driving innovation today? And maybe I can ask you, Natsai, to start off answering.
It's a big question, I think, but it does have implications because it's really about framing. When you start to frame a problem in a certain way, it's going to lead to certain outcomes. And so maybe the example that I can give in industrial biotechnology, very much the trend there is if we are thinking about making new materials out of biological systems, there's a tendency towards formulating the solution according to where it can fit into existing systems without having a critical perspective as to whether or not that existing system is the one that we desire for the future. And the argument that's always made is the drop-in replacement is cheap, it's efficient, and we just don't really have to change much except for the core ingredient. And for me, this sounds like fear because it's not wanting to actually push the boundaries as to what can innovation look like. It's not questioning business models. It's not questioning whether or not we are satisfied with the status quo. And so one really key example that I always like to use in is actually in fast fashion. So biotechnology offers us a plethora of new chemical inputs that are really going to change the environmental impact on how we produce, manufacture, and distribute textiles through to fashion and interiors. The textile industry is one of the most polluting in the world, I think second only to the fossil fuel industry. That's not a mistake because so much of that materiality comes directly from fossil fuels. So when we look at pigments, for example, pigment production, fossil fuel pigment production, its toxicity, its requirements around water, biotechnology offers real solutions to that, bio-based chemical inputs that are grown at ambient temperature, or fermented, I should say, at ambient temperature by microbes. So from a design perspective, I think, wow, well, if we're fermenting these organisms to create pigment that's going to go on a textile, and that textile is going to be used in fashion, that potentially doesn't just disrupt the chemical industry, it disrupts fashion manufacturing and production and even distribution. It disrupts culturally how we understand the fashion object, which is really important because the dangers of then focusing on the drop-in replacements, because it's cheap, it plugs into existing industry and frameworks and supply chains, is that we end up using these so-called innovations for industries that some would argue are part of the problem, for industries that we actually also need to divest from industries that are creating waste that's ending up in landfill and in our oceans. So for me, maybe if we step back and say, are we trying to solve a climate crisis or biodiversity crisis, and is the drop-in replacement, i.e. looking at it from a systems point of view, the way to go? Some would argue that no, it's not. And so if we think more creatively about other ways of deploying at scale those technology that aren't about producing a pigment molecule that has parity to the fossil fuel equivalent, but that is driven by how do we have secure supply chains that employ craftspeople across the world, of which there are many, by the way, and that help to reinforce existing industries in fashion where they are. Then you can start to have a slightly different, less panicked response to what innovation can look like there. And so for me, the idea of distributed biotechnology is an invitation to think beyond the fears that lead to risk management perspectives around how to scale and help us think about other ways of doing things. So I think that on a case-by-case basis, there are plenty of examples where fear is leading the thought process as to how innovation should play out. And I think it's really important to be able to step back and think otherwise.
Thank you. Jerry, you have a comment on this?
Yeah, it's both. Okay, your question was, is it fear or opportunity, right? And the answer has to be both. I mean, but what creates a sustainable innovation is that the thing you're responding to has enough stability, that the problem statement has enough stability that you get to experiment and deploy over and over again different solutions against it. So the opportunity-centric innovation is more interesting in a way because it appeals to, you know, the process of science. Science takes decades to evolve its discoveries, and then to translate them into practice is a real challenge. But it's pretty, compared to crisis response, it's a pretty sane environment. And we have ways to stress it, to accelerate it. We call it, you know, lean innovation, lean launchpad. There are different things we've even done together, you know, in seminars to teach different ways of quickly experimenting with different business models, discovering product market fit. But that's all opportunity centric. The response to a challenge that's a fearful response drives quick experiments because of the urgency. And those experiments, when the crisis resolves, those solutions may have been good in that moment, but may not be robust. So you might do a step up and then a step back because you've done a quick solution. You put a Band-Aid on the wound, but in the end, you have to go back and suture the wound and try and cure it correctly. So I definitely think stress for innovation comes from both dimensions, fear and opportunity. I think the key is to try and think of what you can achieve with the resources you can access and stimulate. So within the time frame you have. And those resources are going to come from various players, but if you don't have the ability to get access to the players that have the resources and convert them to your cause, that's the key for collaboration. So in a longer time frame, when you're opportunity centric, the other players may not feel the urgency, right? Because they're stable, they're in place, they have the money to invest, or they have access to the markets, they have products to serve those markets. So I hope this answer means something that can be translated to reality for the group we have here. But you know, if we look at what's going to come out of war, I hate to say that, but there must be tremendous innovations happening right now in the world where people are under, you know, at war, where they're under real imminent threats. And they're doing things that we don't even know about because they're just doing them. They're not doing them to achieve an opportunity. They're doing them to survive. Some of those things we're going to look 3-4 years from now and look back and say, oh, where'd this come from? Oh, well, that was because we didn't have any of X and we substituted Y. And it helped us. And that substitution happened and it stuck, and maybe it sticks for the long term. But the opportunity-centric one is one that appeals to the scientists, I think, because it's everybody can perceive, rightly or wrongly, where they think their science has an opportunity to be deployed. The challenge is that oftentimes those expectations are not real, right?
Yeah,
so you have to get out in the real world and experiment.
Yes, thank you. So what I see is like, looking back at the COVID, so there was a lot of research going on that we could speed up from based on fear. When the COVID hit, sort of a lot of things that already were existing technology that people were researching on came suddenly, like based on fear, that you could gather, and all the regulatory stuff, you could speed up the process. But you need to have had something in place in the innovation system to sort of take that moment of opportunity.
Yeah, well, just to emphasize that point, it's right. It's the opportunity you've been working on for 5 years. All of a sudden you say, gee, there's a need this moment, and other people recognize it and give you the opportunity to deploy it. That's mRNA right there.
Yes.
And then what we also saw with COVID was that on distribution, I mean, there are parts of the world that haven't received vaccinations yet. We've all moved on in the West, and yet there's a gap in distributing the benefits of that rapid innovation. So I think that's going to be the challenge in the long term, is how do we design for parity?
Definitely.
Well, I'd love to hear from the other panelists on that, because that's a real disturbing fact. I mean, and it's not just, you know, it's not just the vaccine, it's food. You know, you can take almost anything that's essential to life, and you recognize that the world we don't solve problems based on happiness. We solve problems based on capital exchange, right? So that's beyond the scope of our discussion, but it is really central as to healthcare. What is that? What is a human right? And what obligation do we all have to share?
Yeah, so that could sort of lead me on, Anita. Maybe you can pick up on the previous question if you like, but also like thinking about like when we're having with this COVID and but the war, like the supply chains that we have, like, are we just rebuilding the same ones that we had, or have we made some like through novel innovations sort of like this? But as she said, there are some parts of the world that the supply chains are not even going to. But do you have any thoughts about this, Anita?
I don't have the facts or any detailed knowledge about all the world's distribution, but it's a fact that we all feel, the whole world felt like the innovation came fast in terms of vaccines. And some parts of the world, the Russians made their own vaccines, and you know there's so many different versions of the story. But I feel like if it happens again, this is my question: what would we do differently? What have we learned? You know, this is what everybody's talking about now. What did COVID teach us, and what did we learn? The industry learned a lot. The governments learned a lot. The healthcare public sector learned a lot. So I mean, so these learnings need to be consolidated, and then, you know, at the next crisis, we need to be more prepared. This is my take on evolution of getting better and creating a better world. It's not the full vision that you have, but it is important that we have this learning mindset, not only innovating and entrepreneurship, but also learning and also build on the learnings. So that's what I would just want to say generally, but I want to comment on the risk-taking part when disruption comes. I mean, big and large corporation and venture capitalists, don't you think they will sit tighter on their capital and secure their part of the business or the investments, and then the acceleration of the innovation will go fast and be, like you said, a quick run, but then it will be slowed down by the curve when it comes up to the scale and the part where you need capital. That's what I'm worried about now moving forward when we're in the middle of the crisis. Where does, you know, all this capital come from that we need to scale up? Is that the larger corporations, or is it the responsibility of the public-private sector that needs to step up? And yeah, it's a big question, but I'm really struggling with that, because we see also that innovation will die. You know, there's a lot of companies I know that are, you know, right at the edge of dying now because of this situation. They cannot find funding.
Yeah, that's really critical. And I see,
You know,
Jerry, you were about to say something.
I could address that if you'd like. I mean, it's a messy process. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just an ugly, wasteful process in a way. What I'm talking about is innovation, venture capital, new company formation. You can say it all with a smile and say, oh, look at this great value creation. And it is net, bottom line, end of the day, inputs in are less than the outputs out. In other words, this process of innovation and venture capital, new company formation, entrepreneurship creates value. Does it create value for everybody in the process? Absolutely not. It's about, it's a private marketplace stimulated by people seeking returns, in other words, profits. And different players have different appetites for different types of risk. And they participate on daily judgments. In other words, they can support a company at one point and later on not want to support that same company, even though they're already invested and they're going to lose their investment if they don't continue to support it. But if we didn't have that marketplace pressure, we also wouldn't have productivity. So it's the key, if there is a key, is to help create a system that recognizes that failure is not failure. In other words, that failure may mean failure in terms of economic loss and years spent on something that doesn't come to fruition. But the society does not look at those individuals and say they failed, therefore they're people who failed, therefore we don't support them. Societies can look at people who have endeavored to create value and say, these are people who have learned a lot, but they've gained is experience. And so I hate to say the trite thing, but in the trite statement is, in Silicon Valley, we don't call failure failure, we call failure experience. And in fact, when you're hiring, somebody and they say, well, I've been at 3 companies and 2 of them failed, and 1 had successes in this way. You look at each of those failures, not as failures, but you try and learn, well, what did you learn from that experience? What was the cause of failure? Was it internal, external, et cetera, yada, yada. And so there's not a cultural bias. And that is one of the elements of a system of innovation where our community recognizes the value creation even when the business fails. Now, the fact that, you asked a very big question, I go on forever, I apologize, but that I'll keep it short and just say it's a messy process. And the true scaling oftentimes requires a concentration of marketplace around a single standard or a single solution that gains traction. When that happens, a lot of other solutions fall by the wayside. And they may have been just as good as the one that got the centrality of power, but they didn't, and the other one did. And that's the way it works. So you ended up with Betamax versus, you can go back to the VCR, you can go back to all sorts of solutions where the suboptimal technology actually became the standard. And it was good enough. And for whatever reason, it got global scale. I loved your discussion, Anita, of the Russian experience with the vaccine. And I don't want to delve into it here, but it's very true. Not everybody responded with mRNA. And it's also these artificial barriers where, some governments supported their internal solutions versus the one that works. Anyway, it's very unfortunate, but that's the real world.
Yeah, so this sort of fits very well. We got a question from one of the attendees asking this, so might fit very well with the discussion about who is responsible for the scaling and how do we make this. So here's the question, should there be incentives to not only come up with disruptive technology, but also more long-term, long-lasting ones? With the current global warming challenges, for example, it seems like some technologies thought to be disruptive drive lots of investments only to be replaced a few years later, resulting in apparent waste. Any of you want to think about this? Because this is sort of like the shared responsibilities, like you're talking about the elements in the cluster of innovation, who's driving this. So is it the government, or a combination of public and private? So any thoughts about how can we set up incentives?
Yeah, I'd be happy to hear from the other panelists, but I of course have a thought, which is that government incentives are artificial but necessary. At the very minimum, government has to facilitate giving permission, because in a lot of spaces, when you're dealing with resources from the commons, in other words, things that deal with a common benefit or use resources from the commons, like the oceans. The easiest example of the oceans. An example I can deal with that I was just dealing with yesterday is we're looking at mining from the ocean bottom, right? That's an old problem, right? It'd be very disruptive to mine the ocean bottom, but who owns the ocean bottom? You get into that, the whole issue. So there's a whole governmental issue there of who owns what, right? And it's going to be, I don't want to be ridiculous, but it's going to be a very big issue, even like in desalination. I don't know if your folks are active in desalination, but we're talking about brine mining and desalination because you use reverse osmosis. Well, who owns the brine? You might think it's naturally the processor of the water, right, who's doing the desalination would own the residual, right? That would make sense. But if the water itself, if we attribute ownership to the water, you know, that water is not necessarily, you just extract the water from the ocean. Does that mean you own it? I mean, you know, so you can get into these questions. The reason I'm raising this, why am I raising it, is because the question was about who gives the support. And what government can do is at least give permissions. That's essential. It can also provide incentives like financial support. But and it does certainly in healthcare in many ways. And many people are expert at, they make their whole career at knowing how to apply for certain types of funding. But all these types of funding, government or private, have a marketplace. They have a solution they're supposed to address. And that marketplace has a time frame. In other words, they're supposed to take something from the bench to you know, a minimum viable product. Venture capitalists want to take things from a minimum viable product to some sort of scale deployment, but not deployment at scale, but where the deployment at scale is visible. And that's when a venture capitalist wants to exit the opportunity, because that's when the potential is clear, the risk is reduced, and they can capture a lot of the economics because the benefit is clear. And that's where major corporations step in with lower risk profile, and they're satisfied to take a 11% or 15% internal rate of return on the scaling, or 20%, versus the venture capitalist is honestly looking for a 50 to 100% IRR. But the venture capitalist recognizes that 7 out of 10 opportunities that he or she is investing in is going to fail. So they have different profiles. Where in a major corporation, if I said, I'm the VP of engineering and 7 out of 10 things I do fail, I won't be the VP of engineering very long. You know, there's a different risk profile. So it's a combination of government giving permission and doing fundamental funding of long-term research that has no direct application to a market, but application to a problem. It's private sources like venture capital, taking it from the bench to deployment in a minimum viable way. And then large-scale private enterprise taking it to massive deployment, which might also then include government's resources as well. But it's a dance. It's a dance of many players.
Thank you. Yeah, so leading me to think about like this people, planet, and profit. We need to make sure that our innovations are keeping in mind all of these parts to be sustainable. And that's a big discussion. So we are getting close to the end. So I see I still have lots of questions I would love to ask you, but to make sure that I have your vision for the future, I will actually kick off with the answers or the question that I had for you to look into the crystal ball. Each one of you, if I can challenge you to think, like, if you could look into the crystal ball and predict what would you think would be the next innovation technologies that will have a major impact in the next 10, 15 years, and perhaps in a Nordic context, if that's possible to comment on. So Anita, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I can make 2 comments for the crystal ball. The vision would be to make Norway a major player in biotech and learn from our oil and gas history to partner up with the best in the world, because we have the best health registries, we have a digital framework and infrastructure, and why shouldn't Norway be on that map in these days? So that would be my first vision in the crystal ball. And then I touched upon my second in my introduction, that I am a strong believer in the world of treating nature with nature in a way. Even though I'm from pharma, this is my big slogan personally, that, you know, to start with the microbiome and the gut health, and to really try to understand our body and how disease and therapy play a role, and all this for me is like, at the end of the day, if you don't have a healthy world, you will not have a healthy economy or a healthy prospect of life. So, I mean, this is all linked with the economy and also with innovation for me. I'm a big believer that more innovation in health sector will come in terms of digital, at-home hospitals, home monitoring, diagnostics. I mean, everybody now has done self-testing. Why shouldn't we do more self-testing and move the constraint on the hospital budget, you know, outside as well? I mean, there's so many incentives to do that, and that requires a lot of collaboration and innovation. I think also in the future that the health will circle around AI tools. Obviously, I mean, we are creating technology that is faster, gives more accurate answers, and we should take advantage of that. I mean, we don't have enough people to treat all the elderly and all the diabetes patients and all things that are coming. So that's one thing as well. And I said a lot of things, but let me end with the microbiome as well. If I could just give you a picture in the future, in 10 to 20 years, I hope that when you go to the doctor and ask for something, you will have a blood test, a gene test, and a microbiome test. And based on that profile, the AI tools or the chatbot or whatever med chatbot would give you, you know, your personal precision diagnostics and therapy and the way you should, you know, be treated in your patient journey. So this is my vision. I hope I live to see it. I will do my best to work on it from different angles, and love to collaborate with all of you and also the participants. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Anita. Natsai, you want to follow up?
I thought about this question, and maybe my answer won't be terribly coherent, because I don't like this question.
Sorry.
I hate being asked. No, it's not personal. I always hate being asked, like, tell us what's coming. And it's just like, well, you know, there are a lot of things that have emerged, particularly around AI, that have completely blindsided us. So let's not get too comfortable about what happens in a year's time, even. But I think it's an important one because it has made me really question this, like, what counts as innovation? So I moved to Norway just during the pandemic, an act of madness, because I really believe in how psychogeography determines how you see the world. And I've been very intrigued by Norway, its geography, and therefore its culture, and what that demands of people who live here, the light, the dark, the cold, the beautiful summer, the forest, the water. And I wanted to live somewhere where my mind could be changed by the geography that I exist in. I lived in London before. It's a completely different paradigm. And it kind of links to what Jerome was talking about earlier, about geography as being such an important factor in innovation, and that what happens in Silicon Valley and the culture that exists there surely is unique to that part of the world. And I'm sure you go to other parts of America and it's a completely different culture. So there is a question about what are the cultural drivers of technology in a context like Norway. I'm fascinated by that. And I would like to posit that anyone building any technology today anywhere in the world has to contend with the cultural technologies that map onto the more technical scientific formation of tech and innovation as we see it. If we can marry those two things together, something new arises. And I'm very intrigued by the cultural resonance of nature in Norway, and how that affects how people think about innovation in a place-based paradigm. Because when you look at the bioeconomy in Norway, from a tertiary perspective, you are looking at fishing industries, you're looking at forestry. But when we're talking about industrial biotech, we're talking about using other technological systems to add value. And how you build those systems out to respond to the natural geographies of this place, which is about can we get water from point A to point B, transportation? There are mountains that make transportations very difficult here in some places, feedstocks, waste streams. How can we leverage all of those things? And that a biotech industry that emerges out of here is true to the values that people hold. And that maybe if you can get that input early, then you start to create a holistic evolution rather than a disruptive moment. Because I don't like this word disruption. Where can we have everyone moving with us towards something as equal participants in? And I think to do that, you build on what works, and what is working well. So my next challenge, being now a 3-year resident of Norway, is to actually learn the language, because if you don't understand the language, you can't really unlock the psychogeography here. So there's this other layer, right? So that's what I would put forward. There are all sorts of other technologies like language that we should be considering as being part of this innovation stack. And then the stakeholders start to change very quickly. The challenges, these institutions that we need to build, these contexts in which innovation happen in. Like I said, who gets to play the game and when?
Thank you. Really inspiring to hear your thoughts coming from London, moving to Norway. So we are getting close to the end, and I want to just briefly comment. So the circular bioeconomy, like now with the fish, the byproducts coming out of the fish industry, how we use biotech tools to sort of enhance the value and try to get more products and like a more out of just not only the food, but also like new products. That sort of a lot of things happening in that area in Norway, and maybe also will be part of that. So Jerry, I will challenge you for a few minutes to sort of also give us your crystal ball view or thoughts.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I feel like a foreigner. I mean, it's not for me to, speak on behalf of a different culture and a different society. But things that strike me when I think of Norway, and I've had the sincere pleasure visiting and teaching with you for maybe a half dozen times, so I have some exposure and I have good friends who live there. What strikes me is the opportunity you have. One, it's already been mentioned about exploiting the excellence in oil and gas, right? And extractive industry, that there's tremendous expertise there. And having that crossover into life sciences seems like a natural. So, and that's enough of a opportunity to focus on for the rest of your life. And I think that's a great goal. But there's also a hidden opportunity in the uniformity of your culture. And on a global context, you're relatively uniform. And you have I would think, a relatively stable cultural set of norms in terms of what's right and what's wrong. A higher level, perhaps, of trust in government than is normally found, not I would say normally found, but is found many other places. And that is a very huge asset for experimenting with the agency or the power that can be deployed through artificial intelligence. AI is dependent on a data set. It's not the algorithm, it's the data set. And data sets are germane to a certain population. So when you have a more uniform population and you already have, your health system already has, as I think as Natsai pointed out, a great set of data on your population. I may be wrong, but I think I've been led to believe that this is a great resource, and it's a great resource that AI can be deployed against using the trust, the social trust of the society, to begin to experiment with how the professional, the medical professional or the scientist, whoever, can use the tools of artificial intelligence, not to replace the professional, but to augment the professional, so that greater power is given to the individual in assigning treatments or diagnosis. And you probably have an advantage there because of the social trust, that you may be able to build a leading capability that might then translate to other cultures. There might be things that are unique to Norway, but there are likely going to be highly generalizable elements of learning. So you could become a center of the medical deployment or biological deployment of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
It's a thought, and they're actually, I think when you get underneath it, there's going to be overlay with oil and gas in there, because they do a lot of modeling and a lot of same types of talents involved.
Yeah.
So that might be something.
Yes, so I see we're running out of time. So I really appreciate I think we need new innovations to solve a lot of challenges in the future, both diagnostic, but also like sustainable environment. So I think we need to come together and talk more across discipline like we did today. And I really would like to thank the expert panel for a really excellent contribution and inspiration for us to keep thinking of good solutions. But also I would like to thank the organizers, the Digital Life Norway and the Life Science clusters for organizing this webinar. So thank you very much. And I hope to meet you again and discuss further, because I still have lots of more questions that I would like to address. So thank you so much.